The movie begins with Jane walking through a council estate. She is a young woman who is suffering from a severe mental illness. Her walk is fast, her shoulders are hunched, and her blonde hair is unkempt. She stops near a bus station and hears a phone ringing. The jangling noise throws her in a vivid flashback where she is in her room as a young and happy bride, putting a deep blue dress inside her cupboard. The music is enriching, the sun is shining, and when she walks out, everyone including her father and her bridesmaids exclaim with joy upon seeing her. She herself is radiant with happiness and can't help beaming all the way to the church. It could not be a more perfect day. However, the happy swell of music suddenly turns somber as they halt their car outside. The bridesmaids approach the car and inform her that the groom has not turned up and there is no answer from him. Her mother swims into view and bitterly complains she's never been in a more embarrassing situation. Jane's words have died in her throat. She calls her fiancé, tears running down her face as she pleads and apologizes to him. She tells him she wants things to go back the way they were before. The sound of the telephone brings her back to the present. The phone is innocently the same red as the phone she held when she was pleading with him. The jarring jingle freezes her to the core. She cannot take more of this sound and exclaims shit. The phone immediately stops ringing. She breathes a slow thank you and moves on. On the bus ride to her doctor, there is an air of disorientation around her as if she's not perceiving her surroundings at all. She's seated in front of her therapist who asks her how she's been doing. The sound of the phone rings in the background as she tells him she's fine. He repeats her words with a questioning stare, and she immediately corrects herself and says she feels good. The doctor asks if she's in depression and she dimly replies no, and cracks a sad joke. The doctor tells her that he wants her to be like the picture on the wall of a person on a beach, enjoying the waves as they lap against the sand. She vaguely agrees, not knowing what she's agreeing to. Back at her house, she sits in her sad little room, very close to the TV, and sips milk. In the next scene, Jane is on her way to visit her family, hands full of presents. Leading them in the living room, she tells them she bought her own presents as she's tired of being gifted socks and soaps all the time. All her family needs to do now is to provide the money for the presents. It is an awkward situation as her sister Nicola tells her she doesn't want to get Jane an expensive bag, but Jane just brushes off her complaints. She insists on opening the presents in front of them, all the while exclaiming with joy as she rips off the wrapper. She keeps asking where they get them from. All of it would have been funny if everything wasn't so painfully sad. Her family sends her off to have Christmas dinner with her sister, Alice. Alice is also weirded out with Jane but reluctantly takes her home despite her singing a bizarre rendition of a Christmas song. Around the table, Alice's family watch her uncomfortably as she guzzles down the food, commenting on its weird taste. She offers Alice's son a Christmas cracker, but Alice informs her that he's upset as his dog died of cancer that very morning. Jane, unsympathetically, remarks that it was inevitable as cancer ran in their family. Later, she's sitting with her therapist who scolds her. He doesn't just want her to be fine, he wants her to be better and decides to change her medication. She dimly protests against this, but the doctor is firm. The movie shows her having another one of her schizophrenic episodes, and what's real and what's not is unclear. The next moment, she's sitting in front of her parents in her living room as her mother confronts her about her health and the state of her house. She carelessly informs Jane she's getting tired of being blocked by Alice and wants to move away. A mysterious call diverts them from the conversation and Jane goes to pick up the phone. A man is on the line asking if she's talked about them to her parents, and when she says she hasn't, he laughs and reminds her that he loves her. Jane deliriously informs him she loves him too. Is this man real? We can't really tell. Back at the table, her parents inform Jane that the mother is very ill and leaves, forbidding her to inform Alice. When they leave, Jane finds herself locked in a flurry of her own thoughts. Her doctor appears in her mind, telling her to stop fighting depression and creepily smiles at her. The next moment she's walking in darkness, and suddenly, it's daytime. We see Jane sitting at the very same spot in her dingy living room. The TV anchor can be heard urging her to make a change in her monotonous routine, and tells her to stop taking her medication. The wind blows and the medication drops into the bin. Her awful sister Nicola and her friend turn up at the apartment. Nicola wants to claim money for having a mental illness and asks her sister for tips on acting like one. She quizzes Jane on what happens if she doesn't take medicine, and Jane informs them that around 9, she can see spiders with faces crawling along the walls. Some even happen to go down her throat. When the lady from the mental health comes to check up on them, she encounters a baffling scene. The three of them are sitting together and Nicola is giving the performance of a lifetime, acting like a deranged maniac. With Jane backing them up, they manage to convince the lady that they are all mental patients. Her sister soon leaves, but not before asking for money from Jane. We see Jane constantly struggling with her mind. At lunch, she tells Alice that her husband might be having an affair, and Alice tells her not to think of silly things. Later, the same man calls her again, and hatches a plan in her mind. Is he real or just one of her conjured fantasies? Well, I assume the latter. She visits Alice's son Jack and picks him from school without telling the parents. Then she tells him she used to be a model and shows him an old album. Jack thinks that the lady in the picture looks nothing like her, and she hits the brakes hard. Jack collides with the headboard and loses consciousness. When he comes to, she tells him that he was attacked and reveals to him that she's his real mother. Back at Alice's place, Tony and Alice examine the bump on his head and Tony loses his composure completely with Jane. He tells her off for her unpredictably odd behavior, but Alice firmly shuts him down. In complete silence, Tony then drives Jane back to her house. She quietly accuses him of sleeping with another woman and flings her hand twice on his face. A bewildered Tony watches her as she leaves, thanking him for the lift. Afterwards, the man's voice rings in her head. He tells her he won't trust her again if she doesn't manage to get a hold of Alice's son, Jack, and Jane desperately promises him she will. At a Halloween party, she convinces Jack that everyone around them is actually dead and they need to find a way to escape. Jack is uncomfortable, but she manages to drag him outside, where her fictional lover Johnny promised to meet her. No one turns up and Jack runs back in the house. Jane can't make sense of what is real and what is not and starts panicking. She races back home, takes her pills that she had abandoned, and goes into a nervous breakdown. She remembers herself, a much younger and beautiful version, standing in a brilliant blue dress and failing to make an introduction to the judges of the beauty pageant. She recalls how her mother decided to give her dress to Nicola to wear even though she was bothered by it, and how her sister won the pageant. Everyone had liked Nicola, no one gave her a second thought. In the doctor's lobby, she meets a man named Mike. He also suffers from schizophrenia and immediately takes a liking to Jane. He tries to ask her out, but Jane is stubborn. She refuses to have an intimate partner. From her bag, she brings out a toy gun and points it at Mike, who falls on the floor, pretending to be hit. She allows him to drive her home, and when he asks if he could see her again, she agrees. He takes her out on a date and has actually bought a present for her. She opens it to find blue flowers and a newspaper clipping he had saved all these years. It is a picture of her, back in the days when she used to be in the pageant. This sweet gesture touches Jane's heart. Later, she agrees to see him perform with his band Mike and the Truth Detectives. It turns out, there is no band. He is alone but gives it his all in the performance. He'd never thought that she would ever get to witness his performance, despite him having attended many of the pageant shows she took part in. When they are having dinner, he tells her he doesn't believe she's ill. In fact, the world is sick because it likes to control how they act, what they eat, what they watch, and what they wear. Everything around them is probably a lie. Jane finds his interest in her endearing and breaks out into a song. When she finishes, he leans forward and kisses her. The movie shows a happy montage of the both of them spending time together. They dance around, play music in bed, and kiss each other in hallways. Content and happy, they even engage in rather awkward lovemaking. Clearly, they're falling in love with one another. Even when Jane receives another call from Johnny, she refuses to pick up. Subsequently, they both share their feelings of love towards another. At dinner, Nicola informs the group that she's getting married to the older gentleman sitting next to her. Alice is speechless, but what really turns her cogs on is when she hears that Mike doesn't have a job. She disapproves of Jane and Mike living together, but Jane tells her off for treating her like a child. She wants to be the one to decide what makes her the happiest. Things get emotional when Mike goes down on one knee and asks her to marry him. She sobbingly agrees, but Alice is mortified. She tells them she doesn't approve of them being together. Jane finally has had enough. She asks her family why they can't be happy for her and leaves, remarking that Alice is too jealous and too blind to see her own husband having an affair. Tony angrily gets up and accuses her of not taking her medication, but Jane gets the last word in and leaves. The mother is even worse. At first, she berates Jane on why none of her kids took her seriously when she announced the news of her illness. She increasingly decides to be more hard when she forbids the both of them from marrying, and insists Jane to recognize her true purpose in the world, which was to open her eyes. She bitterly insults Mike and orders him to stay away. However, Jane and Mike try their best to deal with the unpleasantries. Mike finally arranges a ring for her even though he doesn't have a job, and Jane clearly finds a reason for living and for happiness when she's with him. Her sister Nicola suddenly breaks some bad news. The old fiancé of hers unexpectedly passed away, and Nicola informs Jane she might be turning just like her. Later, when Mike, Jane, and Nicola watch television together, Nicola cruelly recounts the story of getting to wear Jane's beautiful blue pageant dress and winning the contest. Her triumphant recollection triggers feelings of betrayal and abandonment that Jane consistently encounters from her family, and she faces another one of her nightmarish schizophrenic episodes. She wakes up, suddenly all alone in her apartment, a strange ringing in her ears. Something is very wrong, and it truly is, when she walks in on her sister and Mike engaged in passionate lovemaking. In that moment, her world truly breaks apart and she experiences physical pain all over her body. The next couple of days, she's trapped in her own mind, watching her younger self peeling the wallpaper. Whatever reason she had to stay alive was so cruelly snatched from her that she considered taking caught in utter despair. The next scene shows her being brought to a mental asylum. The nurses keep her on pills, and she feels too tired to register the days passing and what's happening around her. When her parents visit her, her mother cruelly hands her a shampoo to treat hair loss, and when she protests against the pills, her father just tries to convince her that she's getting better. They leave her in the hospital, and she can't even leave the bed to go after them because of the pain. Her mind rings with Johnny's voice as he asks her how she's been doing, showing a relapse in her mental state. She tries to run away, but the doctors catch her. The phone rings for her, and when she goes to pick it up, it's Johnny's voice telling her he loves her, and she whispers to him that she wants things to go back to the way they were. His treacherous love confessions keep rolling in her mind until she snips the telephone cord with the scissors. It is Alice who takes her back home when she's released from the hospital. Their mother is on her deathbed and she wants to meet the three sisters. They all reconcile their bitterness towards each other, and the mum passes on later in the evening. Soon each sister comes to terms with their life. Alice discovers her husband in a car really and truthfully having an affair. Jane moves back in her apartment, where she covers all the holes that usually allow to peek at her broken past self, and Nicola is all alone, with her friend by her side. The picture of the person at the beach is now depicting Jane in her overgrown trench coat, and when her doctor asks her who she is, she can turn the tables back at him by asking him if he's happy. That takes him by surprise, as truly there is no answer to such a question. The movie ends with Jane standing in a beautiful blue apartment having her picture taken. When she asks the photographer how he is, he replies that he's normal, and Jane thinks that's completely boring.